I would hazard to say that amongst all of the concerns and fears we encounter in the present moment, that one of the greatest dangers to us individually, as well as a society, is that of mob psychology. It has taken on a new term in recent history of groupthink. Now, groupthink is nothing new. It has shown its head innumerable times on a grand scale throughout human history. It raises its profile frequently in small groups. We see it in literature when we call to mind the image of Frankenstein as the mob with torches and pitchforks storm Frankenstein's castle in search of the monster. Now, if it were only a brief flare-up, such as in Frankenstein or in the BLM riots, we would call it an anomaly. A destructive but brief act that would then subside and the people return to a more rational state of mind. Now, the reason I highlight groupthink or mass psychology as one of our greatest dangers is that it is no longer a brief phenomenon, but one that has actually pervaded every aspect of our society, and worse, pervaded otherwise reasonable individuals' thinking. Now, throughout history, you often find such activity, especially in the realm of politics throughout history, as society gets stirred up when the leaders want the mob to go to war for them. Mm-hmm. But today, we don't find that that's the dominant place even. It's in other realms that have been up till now less susceptible. For we see this mob mentality, this groupthink, even in places such as science, and theology, and technology. What is this mass mind, this groupthink? Well, it is that irrational loss of individual identity, the loss of the ability to think independently, that then gives rise to irrational actions and sometimes even violence. Mm-hmm. In a word, the individual becomes deaf, blind, unable to speak, dumb, and hears only what the group utters. What the group thinks is what the individual thinks. Mm. And then that person can no longer speak as an individual, but only the words given by the group. The danger is there because we see it, as I say, in places that it hasn't been really profoundly seen in history. We see it now in science, as opposing mobs thrust their intellectual pitchforks in the air about whether climate change is real or not real. We see it in theology, as opposing groups swing their torches regarding various social issues that have now entered the church. And even technology, whereas with science one would hope that facts well considered and weighed would rule, here too in technology we see a mob where things such as either artificial intelligence or vaccines are seen as panacea or the end of the world. politics and other groups have shown us one thing. They have no answer to this. They have no good response to healing this malady of mob mentality, mass psychology, groupthink. But thankfully, as we will see, Jesus has an answer. And his answer is to step aside. Step aside from the mob. Step aside from the group. Enter into a moment of silence. A moment of silence in which you take time to think, to feel, to pray, to listen to God, and only then to let something come about in action, to decide. The great psychologist Carl Jung saw this mob mentality as essentially demonic. It's been written, Jung regarded mass-mindedness as a danger and mass psychology as a dangerous germ infecting us.
Yes.
Why? What's so dangerous about large groups and crowds? Well, Jung felt crowds let loose what he called the dynamisms of the collective man. Beasts or demons that lie dormant in every person until he becomes part of the mob. He went on to say that large groups blot out individual morality and cause individuals' consciousness to sink to a lower level. Crowds stir up fears, which can lead to a whole population having, as he says, a feeling of catastrophe in the air. This is a diagnostic moment of saying what's wrong with our society. That feeling of catastrophe is always in the air, says that the whole society has fallen into the disease of this mass mind. That dangerous germ has multiplied within the body of society, and it's now very, very ill. Yes, he would go on to say, crowds and groups induce infantile behavior in people who would otherwise behave in mature and responsible ways. Crowds even cause the best man to lose his value and meaning and lead individuals to become stultified and their personalities to become degenerate. And so, lacking any self-reflection, large groups of people make individuals psychically abnormal. And then, moved by impersonal, overwhelming forces, mobs produce herd psychology and the mass man. Jung repeatedly decried the mass man. Such a person is infantile in his behavior, unreasonable, irresponsible, emotional, erratic, and unreliable. In the mass, the individual loses his value and becomes a victim of isms. Oh, how we have become such victims. And then, claiming no sense of responsibility for his actions, mass man finds it easy to commit appalling crimes without even thinking, and grows increasingly dependent on the state. Jung felt that the larger the size of the group, the greater the dangers, because the lower the overall level of consciousness that will occur. The individual thrust into a large crowd, therefore, would be hard put indeed to resist the pull into unconsciousness and would soon manifest psychic abnormality. When that is in small groups, it's bad enough. And often we call them cults, whether that cult is religious, political, or otherwise. But when it takes over a society, danger of a demonic level hovers above us. And so we look to Jesus and ask, how does one find the rational center again? How do we embrace love and a balanced view of life? And Jesus shows us, as illustrated in the Gospel of Mark. Mark shows us the way in his observations of Jesus, as Jesus goes about today to heal a deaf and dumb man. Now, there are always at least two ways, two aspects to Jesus's actions as they're presented in the Gospels. One is the literal and the other is the subtle. There is the literal observed act. Jesus, as we saw him in the Gospel today, as the people brought to him a man that could not speak and was deaf and asked him to heal him. What does Jesus do? He heals the man so that he can speak and he can hear. Jesus literally is the healer of bodies and souls. But then there's that subtle, deeper meaning, the theological implication of his act. And in this portion of the gospel, we see the compassion of Jesus not merely to heal the individual by putting fingers in his ears, touching his tongue, but also to heal his soul. Jesus is there to bring the ears to hear the depths of truth. He's there to touch the tongue so that you won't be speaking just the words of others, but the words of God. Jesus has shown on the literal level how a Christian is supposed to act. On the literal level, we are called to go forth as those first disciples were in the power of the Holy Spirit to heal bodies and souls. And so we do in that power and authority of the Spirit. We go forth and say to the sick, be well. But Mark has more in mind as he presents these stories. For theologically, he is showing the way to healing the soul and the way of walking in the truth of God. Now, here we read this morning from the 7th chapter of Mark, where a group bring a man who is deaf and unable to speak to be healed. But in the 8th chapter, we're going to see something almost identical happen. As Jesus encounters a group that bring to him a man blind and asking him to heal them. In these two stories, Mark is not just speaking about the wonder worker or our call to go out in the power of the Spirit and bring healing in a temporary way, for that is temporary because everybody we heal will still die. But rather how to bring about an eternal sense in the soul of truth. He's showing how to overcome blindness in the spirit, how to overcome deafness to God, and how to no longer be a puppet of groupthink, but to speak the truth with our own tongue. How is this? Well, we look at the story. The first one we read this morning shows us that when Jesus returned from the region of Tyre, and he went through Sidon to the Sea of Galilee, through the region of the Decapolis, they brought to him a man who was deaf and had an impediment in his speech, and they besought him to lay his hands upon him. And taking him aside from the multitude privately, put his fingers into his ears, and spat and touched his tongue. Looking to heaven, he said, Ephphatha, and that is, be opened. and his ears were opened, his tongue was released, and he spoke plainly, and he charged them then to tell no one. There's something that we overlook so often in this story. When the spectacular nature, and even the end of it, which says he does all things well, if there's such focus on the miracle, the signs and the wonder, we miss something of integral importance here. What is it? It's what Jesus does first. Jesus removes him from the crowd to be alone. They brought him a man who was deaf and an impediment in his speech, and besought him to lay hands on him. And taking him aside from the multitude privately. There is a hint that can't be missed there. Because right in the next chapter, it gets pushed at us again. There a blind man is brought in just a similar manner, and Jesus does the same thing. In that one, and they came to Bethsaida, and some people brought him a blind man and begged him to touch him. And he took the blind man by the hand and led him out of the village. And then when he had spit on his eyes and laid hands upon him, he asked him, "Do you see anything?" And he looked up and said, "I see men, but they look like trees walking." And then again he laid hands on his eyes and he looked intently, and the guy was restored and saw everything clearly. And he sent him away to his home, saying, "Do not even enter the village." He took the blind man by the hand away from the multitude privately. And then, to be even clearer, he says, "Don't go back to them." He sent him away to his home, saying, "Do not even enter that village again. Do not go back to the crowd. It is the crowd that is a problem. Don't return to it." Now, if you only look at this on the literal level, you go, how can the crowd be a problem for a poor guy that's deaf and dumb or blind? It's not there. It's the theological, spiritual level that we hear in this one. The crowd is the problem. How then do we enter the rational center again? How do we embrace again love and a balanced view of life? We let Jesus take us by the hand and lead us out of the crowd, out of the world of groupthink, out of the mass of mass psychology, out of the mob. And then we let him, when we're together with him away from that, touch our ears, touch our tongues, touch our eyes, cleansing our ears, cleansing our mind, and giving us pure speech that's not of crowd mentality, but of God's thoughts. It's only then that we're able to actually find the rational center. Then we'll be able to take these two opposing sides and listen to them both. And instead of trying to decide who or which is correct, which is a trap always in itself, we now see how the varying facts and evidences for each side might actually create a greater whole. This is what is called consensual thinking. Reasoning by consensus rather than by opinion. Take what both sides of a debate present as facts, and then find the third point, the point of transcendent consensus. It takes time and it takes work. Something that the mass mob mind finds abhorrent. To stop, to wait, to actually not speak is something the mass mind cannot do. It always reacts. without going off far, because I could go too long on this, do you ever wonder why we have so much of a dominant zombie artistic thing in all the movies and the television shows? Because that's what a zombie is. We relate to the zombies. We are zombies. We have had our brains squashed out, and now we just listen to what the master says and walk. Unfortunately, we don't walk with parts falling off us, because at least we'd be afraid of them then. But we are zombies. And Jesus says, let me take you by the hand and get you out of the zombie mass. Let Jesus take you by the hand and lead you into this third place. This is the place of love. So when one person says that climate change is an illusory hoax, and another says that we will all be destroyed within a few years as the rising temperatures burn us up and the seas drown us, what do? We listen to these two. And first we find ourselves confused because we're deaf to the truth, blind to the facts, and unable to communicate anything but what the others say. And so we're dumb because it's all opinion at that point. But when we let Jesus take us by the hand and lead us away from these crowds, when we stand with him in silence until our own rationality begins to return, then in silence, with our gaze focused on what we know of God and the thoughts and feelings that he brings up with us, we'll be healed, and we will begin to put these things together in a rational fact rather than two groups of zombies with their opinions, wanting to eat the other. In politics, we hear both sides today say that democracy is over if the other side wins. Well, it can't be both right. That's the first truth. You can't be, if you're both totally disagreeing, you're probably both wrong. That's the first level of humility. Rather than let's fight until we kill the other side enough so that I can only be the one living and then I'll be right, even though you're wrong. We rather let Jesus take us by the hand and lead us away from both groups. And in silence again, standing with him, we ask not what they proclaim, but what is the fact that they speak? What is the danger presented that will create the fall of democracy? Does one side have a good point? Does the other side have a good point as well? Now we let Jesus put his fingers in our ears, open our eyes, and touch our tongues. And by so doing, we begin to see the facts, hear the truth. And then the screams of the mob are at a distance, and they're not going to deafen and blind us anymore. Then we will be able to speak the truth, even if that means you're all alone in doing it. And frankly, when you're in a world of mob mentality, you will be very alone much of the time. Jeremiah, Ezekiel, Isaiah, they all knew this. They ended up in pits. They ended up persecuted and told how stupid they are. You have to be ready for that. And that's why you don't return to the village. Don't go back to the crowd and say, this is the truth, and expect them to go, oh, I love you for it. You must stand in it. Go home. Don't go back to the crowd. This is the message that will lead us out of this greatest danger, if many would just adopt it. In the midst of this mob, see the hand of Jesus beckoning. Take that hand and let him lead you out of the crowd into the inner place where only you and Jesus are then standing. Then let him open your ears, open your eyes, and loose your tongue for the truth of God. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit.